Sales is not something you do to someone. Sales is something you do for and with someone. And so I'm going to teach you a psychological tactic that will get prospects to say yes 100% of the time. And no, this is not a manipulation technique to take advantage of people, but rather have prospects who already desire what it is that you sell to help them to discover this for themselves. So let me teach you exactly how to do this. Let's start with the problem. So traditional sales training attempts to tell people what they should do, AKA, I tell you what to do and you do it. This is what's being taught. This is what's been taught for a very, very long time. This is what real estate agents continue to listen to that end up just, quite frankly, piss people off. And they end up in this conflict. They end up in these arguments. This is a real script from a famous real estate coach. I'll give you an example of what's being taught today. This is positioned as how to control a conversation. You've heard it 1,000 different times. In traditional sales training, you must control the conversation. Well, what does control actually mean? Here's what's being taught. There are scripts out there that sound like this. Mr. Prospect, I'm going to be in your area tomorrow. Let's meet for 20 minutes so I can show you how I can get your home sold. I can be there at 3 or 4. Which works better for you? All right. Now, let's break this down. Why is this an issue? You might say, well, Brandon, I think that's a really, really good script. Actually, Brandon, that is the script that I use most of the time. Okay. Do you think the prospect is that stupid that magically you cold called someone out of the blue and that you are just going to happen to be in their area tomorrow? Come on. If you don't think that comes across salesy, you're dead wrong. Not only are you wrong, we have data to support that elicits perceived bias. When you say things like, I'm going to be in your area tomorrow, of course, the prospect's sitting there saying, yeah, of course you're going to be in my area tomorrow. Now, that's not even the worst part. The worst part is this next piece. Let's meet for 20 minutes. Let's meet. This is you telling somebody what they ought to do. This is you attempting to control, to force, to assume someone's behavior. And the problem with this type of language is it elicits psychological reactance. So let's listen to a psychologist talk about reactance, and then we'll break this down even further.
It's no secret that people don't like to be told what to do, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody. I know that for me, the more someone tells me that I cannot have fast food, I only want to have fast food all the more, right? If someone tells me that I can't do something, what do I want to do? Exactly that thing. I think that's a fairly common experience. In psychology, this idea is called reactance, which means that people don't like to feel like their freedom of choice is being threatened. If I feel like you're making me do something, you're trying to control me, I react really poorly to it. And a lot of times what happens is that people go ahead and do the opposite. They'll do something that completely counters the thing that they feel like they're being made to do. This is a problem for persuaders, because what is persuasion and influence but trying to get people to do the things you want them to do? So you need to be careful and know that people aren't going to be super open to the fact that you want to guide their behaviors and opinions.
Okay, so then what happens as a result of eliciting so much reactance so much of the time, it actually makes the problem worse. You see, in traditional sales training, it attempts you then to teach how to respond to the resistance, how to respond to the reactance, aka objections. This is where the whole tug of war comes from. You attempt to tell the prospect what to do, to which prospects resist, as you know. They tell you why they won't do what you want them to do, aka an objection. And then you try to come back with some slick, fancy objection handling script that you learned from some famous real estate coach, to which the prospect digs their heels in even more, don't they? And this is what creates this back and forth between salesperson and prospect. I call it the tug of war. They just go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth because both parties in this example are fighting for perceived control. And because both people aren't willing to give it up, no progress is made. Oftentimes, the salesperson's so out of control, the prospect says, well, I don't have to deal with this. They just hang up the phone or they kick you out of their house. So let's discuss the solution. So in reverse selling, we use techniques to get prospects to comply by giving them the perceived control. We give up the control to the prospect. The perception of control needs to stay with the prospect in order to get compliance to go up. Let me explain. This is something called autonomy support. So let's go through autonomy. This is straight out of Miller and Rolnick's Motivational Interviewing, the 3rd edition. It's a great book. It's about 500 pages long, so most of you would never go through it. But for the small percentage of you that actually will, you might learn a thing or two about communication. And guess what? In real estate sales, we are in, that's right, the communication business. Okay, autonomy support. Honoring and respecting each person's autonomy, their irrevocable right to self-direct. The opposite of autonomy support is the attempt to make people do things or control their behavior. On the other hand, directly acknowledging a person's freedom of choice typically diminishes defensiveness and increases compliance. This involves letting go of the idea and burden that you have to or can make people change. It is, in essence, relinquishing power that you never had in the first place. And so the problem with all this traditional sales training, all this crap that's being spewed throughout the internet, is making things worse for you. This is why, my friends, this is why when you attempt to use some of these scripts and these dialogues and this training that you're learning from whatever, said guru, you say to yourself, oh gosh, I just feel salesy. I feel dirty. I don't feel like I'm being myself. I don't feel like I'm being authentic. I don't feel like I'm being genuine. It's because you're not. You're attempting to control people's behavior. And the problem with attempting to control someone's behavior that we just talked about is you get the exact opposite of what you're looking to do. The more you try and tell or convince or persuade somebody to do something, the motivation they have to do the exact opposite goes up. So the very thing that you don't want is the thing that you're getting most. Now, let's talk about how do we fix this. Let's get into the technique, all right? We maintain control by giving the prospect the perception that they have it. We talked about this briefly on the last slide. So in order to maintain control of a conversation, to increase compliance, to have a productive conversation with the prospect, to maintain that control, we have to do so by giving it up, by giving up that perception of control back to the prospect. How do we do this? In reverse selling, one thing that I teach real estate agents is by asking permission-based questions. You see, people feel in power when others ask for their permission. This is a strong psychological tactic. Now, here's the trick. In order for people to maintain the illusion of power, they must comply by granting you permission. And that's the psychological hack we're going to talk about. So in order for you to give the perception of control to the prospect, which is where it needs to stay, we do that by asking a permission-based question. I'll give you some examples in just a second. And the psychological hack or trick, what we know from psychology, is that when somebody feels in control, they want to maintain that control. And in this context of having a conversation with the prospect, the only way they get to maintain their perceived control, the illusion of power, is by granting you your wish, by granting you permission. Now, watch how powerful this is. Asking permission-based questions also opens what we call a curiosity loop. This loop gets opened in the brain that motivates the person to reap the dopamine payoff by finding out what you'll say next. So there's two powerful psychological things happening at the same time. One, someone wants to maintain this illusion that they're in control, which is what you want to do to increase compliance. And then number two, you want to open up a curiosity loop in the mind of the prospect so they reap the reward of the dopamine payoff by finding out what it is that you're going to say next. So let me give you some examples. So in a sales conversation, there's many different nuances and contexts. Here are some questions that you may want to ask. Mr. and Mrs. Prospect, would you hate me if I shared a different perspective? Now, what most people are trained to do is respond with a different perspective or viewpoint, and it creates an argument. So what we're going to do instead in this example is we're going to get the person's permission to share the different perspective. You see, in a debate, in the back and forth dialogue, the reason why things oftentimes escalate and turn into arguments is because one person sharing their viewpoint over the other person, not listening to each other, and no one ever gets permission to share their point of view, and they don't get the benefit of that illusion of control we just talked about. They don't get the benefit of the dopamine payoff. Another one you can use is, Mr. Prospect, listen, before you hang up, I was hoping to ask you something about the home for sale. Would that be okay? Most scripts, most real estate sales scripts, as you have seen all over the internet, try to bulldoze their way into a conversation. Whatever the prospect says, just talk over them, maintain control. Well, yeah, how's that working out for you? They just say, you know what? Click, don't call me again. This is ridiculous. Next one you can ask, Mr. Prospect, can I make a recommendation? Rather than just giving unsolicited advice, which you tell me how that's worked out in your life. When you tell somebody you ought to do X, Y, and Z, you should do X, Y, and Z. How's that typically end up for you? But when you get their permission to make a recommendation, it lands a lot different. Number 4, would it make sense? Probably the easiest way to execute on this technique is to simply use 4 words. Would it make sense? Would it make sense to have this conversation? Would it make sense to talk about what things look like moving forward? Would it make sense for you and I to talk about what next steps could look like? Would it make sense for us to jump on a call? Would it make sense for you and I to meet? Would it make sense for you and I to grab a cup of coffee? Would it make sense? We're giving that illusion of control to the person in which we're communicating so that compliance increases, goes up, not down. Next, number 5, Mr. Prospect, of course, it's up to you because you wouldn't do anything unless it made sense. Would that be fair? Listen, of course it's up to you because let's face it. I mean, you're not going to do anything unless you thought it made sense. Would that be fair? Prospects often say, well, yeah, that's spot on. That's totally fair. Next, can I ask you a blunt question? How many times do you want to be direct, a straight shooter? But then when you do, the other person gets defensive and we create conflict. Get permission to be that way. And then the other person doesn't get defensive. So when you want to call someone out, when you want to challenge something, when you want to deliver something that might be sensitive, get permission to do so. Mr. Prospect, can I shoot you straight? And then lastly, one of my favorite things, we teach this to all of the agents that I coach. At the beginning of a listing appointment, you might say, Mr. Prospect, I'd like to be brutally honest tonight. Even if that means you don't love some of the things I say, would that be okay? What do you think the prospect's going to say? No, I'd rather you BS me all night. They're not going to say that. They're going to say, absolutely, of course. Now you can bring up the stinky pink bedroom without offending them. Now you can explain that their house is not the best house out there without them being offended. Now you can shoot them straight on price, so you don't have to BS your way into convincing the seller to list the house with you that's overpriced and end up not selling. And so as you move forward, start to really work on gaining someone's permission before you start to deliver the message in which you're looking to deliver. I think what you'll find is that compliance agreement goes way up, and you're having to deal with so much resistance and objections and all of the things that you don't love dealing with start to disappear.